On July 19th, 2023, the temperature in Phoenix never dropped below 97 degrees. That was the low, the coolest moment in 24 hours. And it wasn't a freak night. For 15 straight days, the overnight temperature never once fell below 90. During those 2 weeks, 303 people died. Not from the afternoon peak, from the night that refused to end. And the data says those nights are arriving faster than anyone expected. American overnight lows are warming at nearly twice the rate of daytime highs. And in 2022, 86% of the U.S. population experienced nighttime heat, made at least twice as likely by climate change. The number for daytime highs? 20%. If the idea that your city might stop cooling down at night got you locked in, take a second and hit subscribe to Orbital View. We're tracking this nighttime heat trend through the summer and into the grid stress season. Drop a comment. Has your city felt hotter at night than you remember? I read everyone. Tonight's investigation goes somewhere most heat coverage never does. 140 million Americans staring down 90s this week. But the number that matters isn't the afternoon high. It's the one nobody checks, the overnight low. A night in Phoenix that never dropped below 97 degrees, and the 645 people who didn't survive the summer around it. The physiology of what happens when a human body can't cool down for 72 hours straight, and the modeling study that found a single blackout during a heat wave could send roughly half a city to the emergency room. Let's get into it. Part 1. 140 million people and the wrong thermometer. Right now, and I mean literally as I'm recording this, a ridge of high pressure is inflating across the eastern third of the United States like a blister. Washington Post meteorologist Ben Knoll reported it on June 4th. A relatively cool start to the month is about to give way to a bubble of locally record-challenging heat expanding from New England to the mid-Atlantic. On Monday, the first day of meteorological summer, Boston topped out at 58 degrees. New York hit 71. Unremarkable, forgettable, and by Friday, the same cities were staring down the 90s. Washington Dulles had daily record highs in the forecast. 92 degrees Friday, 94 Saturday. Baltimore, Bridgeport, Connecticut, and the whole New York metro area were all in the crosshairs. Around 140 million Americans will see temperatures in the 90s through early next week. For about 12 million more, the heat will hit 100. So the coverage kicks in. You know the drill. Heat advisories scroll across the bottom of your screen. The local news sends a reporter to fry an egg on a sidewalk. Someone posts a dashboard thermometer reading 112 and it goes viral. The entire public conversation locks onto one number, the afternoon high. But here's what I need you to understand, and this is the thing that changes the entire frame of this investigation. The afternoon high is not where most people die. The temperature that kills is the one nobody checks. It's not the peak, it's the valley. It's the overnight low, the number your city is supposed to drop to between midnight and 6 a.m., the window your body depends on to shed the heat it absorbed during the day. And across the eastern seaboard right now, that valley is rising. Down along the Gulf of Mexico, overnight lows in Brownsville, Texas, are holding in the lower 80s. Key West, Florida, stayed as warm as 84 degrees at night through late May, setting 11 overnight records in a single month. These aren't heat index numbers. These aren't feels-like calculations. These are the raw minimums, the coolest the air gets before the sun comes back. And the seasonal backdrop is making these numbers worse. NOAA's Climate Prediction Center, their spring outlook, issued in mid-March, favored above normal temperatures for the majority of the United States this summer. The core of highest confidence sits over Utah, Colorado, Nevada, and the surrounding states, with a 50 to 60% probability of above normal heat. An El Niño watch is active. The CPC gives El Niño an 82% chance of emerging between May and July of this year and a 96% chance of persisting into the winter. And as of mid-March, moderate to exceptional drought covered 55% of the continental United States. That drought detail isn't a side note. Dry soil does something specific and measurable. It stops cooling the air. When soil is wet, energy from the sun goes into evaporating that moisture. Same reason you feel cooler stepping out of a pool. When soil is baked dry, that energy goes straight into heating the air above it. A drought doesn't just kill crops. It removes the natural brake on overnight cooling because dry ground releases stored heat faster, and the atmosphere has less moisture to carry energy away. So that's the frame. 140 million people in the 90s, 12 million above 100. An El Niño tilting the seasonal dice. Drought across more than half the country. And layered underneath all of it, a grid system that depends on overnight cooling almost as much as the human body does. PJM Interconnection, the grid operator serving 67 million people across 13 states and the District of Columbia, issued their summer outlook on May 7th. The National Weather Service told PJM to expect hotter than normal conditions across the Mid-Atlantic and Southern Service Territory. PJM forecast a summer peak demand of around 156,400 megawatts against roughly 180,200 megawatts of generation capacity. Those numbers look like there's margin, but the margin assumes the nighttime demand trough, the hours when air conditioners cycle down, when the grid catches its breath, when operators dispatch maintenance and rebuild reserves. When nights stay hot, that trough vanishes, and the margin evaporates with it. That connection between nighttime heat, human physiology, and the grid that stands between survival and catastrophe is the spine of this investigation. And a national conversation about heat that is still fixated on the afternoon high is missing the most dangerous part of the story. This video is about the part they're missing. And the evidence starts in the desert on a single night that rewrote the record books. Part 2, the night that never ended, July 19th, 2023, Phoenix, Arizona. The sun goes down and nothing changes. The temperature at Sky Harbor International Airport, the official recording station, ticks from 110 to 107, 104, 101. Then it stalls. For hours, the thermometer barely moves. And at the lowest point of the entire night, the coolest the air would get before the sun dragged everything back up, Sky Harbor recorded 97 degrees Fahrenheit. That was the overnight low, not the high, the low, the coolest moment in 24 hours. It was the hottest minimum temperature ever recorded in Phoenix's history. And it wasn't isolated. From July 10th through July 25th, 15 consecutive days, the temperature in Phoenix never once dropped below 90 degrees. Not at midnight, not at 3 a.m. Not at dawn. For 2 full weeks, the concept of nighttime cooling didn't exist. During those 2 weeks, 303 people died in Maricopa County. I need you to hear that number carefully. 303 isn't the toll for the summer. That's the count from the 15-day stretch alone. The Maricopa County Medical Examiner's Office, in a report updated January 23rd of 2025, confirmed 645 heat-associated deaths for all of 2023. That is a 52% jump over the prior record of 425 deaths in 2022. And 2022 was itself a record. So was 2021, so was 2020. 7 consecutive record years. Here's a detail I keep coming back to. Among the indoor deaths where an air conditioning unit was present in the home, the unit was non-functioning in 85% of cases. Not 85% of homes lacked AC. 85% of the units that existed had failed. The equipment broke under the load, and when the AC broke, the building stopped being shelter. It became a trap, walls and roof radiating absorbed daytime heat into a sealed space. The word for that, in thermodynamic terms, is an oven. David Hondula directs Phoenix's Office of Heat Response and Mitigation and holds a faculty position at Arizona State University. He's put numbers to the most exposed population. An unsheltered homeless person in Phoenix faces 200 to 300 times greater risk of heat-related death than the overall population. Not 200 to 300% greater. 200 to 300 times. And the county medical epidemiologist, Dr. Nick Staub, made a point that I think most coverage misses entirely. He said moderate days, days that don't trigger warnings, days that don't make the news, can really add up. If you're vulnerable, the cumulative effect can be very dangerous. That word, cumulative, is doing enormous analytical work in that sentence, because it means the killer isn't the spike, it's the failure to reset. Night after night after night of incomplete cooling, each morning starting from a higher baseline than the last, until the body simply runs out of margin. And 71% of all heat deaths in Maricopa County that year occurred on days when an excessive heat warning was already in effect. The 5-year average? 32%. Sit with that. The warning system was active. People heard it, and deaths more than doubled compared to the historical rate under those exact same warnings. The warnings aren't failing because people ignore them. They're failing because it's going to be hot tomorrow. Doesn't address the mechanism that's actually killing people. The mechanism is the night. Phoenix has been adapting. The city opened its first 24/7 heat respite and navigation center and assembled a regional network of more than 200 cooling facilities. But adaptation is chasing a trend line that keeps steepening, and the people most at risk, the unsheltered, the elderly, anyone whose AC unit fails at 2 in the morning on a Saturday, are the ones the system reaches last, if it reaches them at all. That mechanism, the failure to reset overnight, is not unique to the desert. It travels. And to understand how it kills, you need to understand exactly what happens inside a human body when the night doesn't cool. I need to walk you through some physiology here, but I'm going to do it without the jargon, because the mechanism is intuitive once you see it clearly. Part 3. The machine that breaks. Think of your body as a furnace that runs all the time. You are always generating heat, metabolism, muscle activity, organs working. Even lying still in a dark room, you produce roughly the same thermal output as a 100-watt light bulb. During the day, when the air is hot, your body works hard to dump that excess. Blood vessels near the skin open wide. Sweat glands activate. Your heart rate climbs because the cardiovascular system is now doing 2 jobs simultaneously, delivering oxygen to your organs and routing hot blood to the skin surface where heat can escape into the air. That's a heavy load, but it's manageable for a stretch because the whole system is built around an assumption. The assumption is that night brings relief. Your circadian rhythm, the internal clock, is wired to expect a temperature drop after sunset. When ambient temperature falls, core body temperature follows. That decline is what triggers deep sleep. Metabolic rate slows. Heart rate falls. Kidneys catch up on filtering. The cardiovascular system stands down from emergency duty. The whole machine resets. Now delete the reset. Hold the overnight temperature at 85, 90, 97. What happens is not subtle. Heat production exceeds heat loss, and core body temperature doesn't return to baseline. Sleep fragments. Hot environments suppress REM and deep slow wave stages, the phases where physical restoration actually happens. You wake up, if you slept at all, already running warm. Day 2 begins from a higher thermal starting point than day 1. The heart is still working overtime. Dehydration has thickened the blood. The kidneys are behind. By day 3, the deficit is a hole you cannot climb out of without external cooling. The cardiovascular system is maxed out, cardiac output elevated, heart rate sustained, blood thickened by dehydration. Kidneys, which need adequate blood flow to function, start falling behind. In the worst cases, sustained heat stress triggers rhabdomyolysis, the breakdown of muscle tissue, which dumps proteins into the bloodstream that the overtaxed kidneys can't clear. Multi-organ failure follows, and humidity makes all of this worse in a specific physical way. Your body's last resort cooling mechanism is sweat evaporating off the skin, but evaporation requires dry air. When humidity is high, sweat beads on the surface and runs off instead of evaporating. All the metabolic cost of producing that sweat, the water, the salt, the energy, and none of the cooling. In a humid overnight heat event, you're not just failing to cool. You're burning through your reserves while getting nothing in return. The research confirming this is now substantial, and 2 studies do different things that both matter. The first is Royer and colleagues, published in 2025 in Environmental International. It's a massive multi-country analysis, 178 locations across 44 countries, covering nearly 3 decades from 1990 to 2018. Dominic Royer at the Biological Mission of Galicia led the work with co-authors including Antonio Gasparini, Michelle Bell at Yale, and Joel Schwartz at Harvard. They measured something they called hot night excess, essentially how far above normal the nighttime low stayed and found strong evidence of increased all-cause mortality associated with it across nearly all climates. And critically, this held even after controlling for daytime maximum temperature and humidity. The pooled relative risk at the 90th percentile was about 1.026, roughly a 2.5% increase in the chance of dying. 2.5% sounds small until you multiply it by millions of people over multiple nights. Then it becomes hundreds of additional deaths. But the finding that genuinely stopped me was from the second study, Kim and colleagues, published in Environmental Health Perspectives in 2023. They examined all 47 prefectures in Japan from 1973 to 2015, over 4 decades of national data. A hot night, in their framework, meant any night where the minimum stayed above 25 degrees Celsius, which is 77 Fahrenheit. That's the threshold the Japan Meteorological Agency uses. And during those nights, all-cause mortality jumped 9 to 10%, a relative risk of 1.10, with tight confidence intervals, even after controlling for daily mean temperature. The overnight low was an independent killer, doing its own damage, separate from anything the daytime high contributed. But I want to be precise about how to hold this, because the honest answer is also the interesting one. A 2016 study by Davis, Hondula, and Patel examined 7 U.S. cities and found that in some northern locations, Boston, Philadelphia, Seattle, the strongest mortality signal tracked with maximum afternoon temperature, not the overnight minimum. In warmer southern cities, the nighttime signal was stronger. So the picture isn't simple. I'm not going to tell you the overnight low has dethroned the daytime high as the single best predictor in every city. That would overstate what the evidence supports. What the evidence does support, clearly, is that nighttime minimum temperature is an independent and powerful predictor of death during heat waves. And Boston University's Patrick Kinney, a professor of urban health and sustainability, pointed directly at the mechanism that amplifies it. The urban heat island effect, he said, is particularly important at nighttime. Policies to reduce the heat island, adding trees and green space, using reflective materials, white roofs, would be especially helpful precisely because the danger concentrates after dark. The danger concentrates after dark. Hold that, because it connects to everything that comes next. And there's a harder edge to this physiology. Researchers have long theorized a wet bulb temperature ceiling, a point at which, no matter how healthy you are, no matter how much water you drink, sweat simply cannot evaporate fast enough to cool you. Sherwood and Huber proposed that limit at 35 degrees Celsius wet bulb. In a 2010 paper in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, about 95 degrees Fahrenheit on a fully saturated thermometer. Beyond that line, a healthy young person in the shade with a breeze dies within hours. But empirical work has since lowered the bar. Daniel Vecellio and colleagues at Penn State's HEAT project in 2022 tested actual humans, young, healthy adults, and found they hit their physiological wall well before the theoretical limit. Critical wet bulb temperatures range from 25 to 28 degrees Celsius in hot, dry environments and 30 to 31 in warm, humid conditions, averaging around 30.55 Celsius, well below 35. And for the elderly, the chronically ill, anyone on medications that impair sweating or cardiovascular function, the thresholds drop further still. I'm not going to claim the U.S. is routinely hitting these wet bulb ceilings. It essentially isn't yet. But the margin between where we are and where the physiology fails is narrower than most people understand. And that margin shrinks fastest at night, because that's when humidity peaks, when the urban heat island is strongest, and when the body is supposed to be recovering instead of fighting. So here's the picture. You have a physiological system that requires overnight cooling to survive multi-day heat. You have evidence that overnight cooling is eroding faster than daytime warming across nearly every American city. And you have empirical data showing the body's tolerance ceiling is lower than the theoretical models predicted. Those 3 facts together describe a gap that's closing, not at some theoretical point in the future. Now, measurably, which means the right question isn't how hot will it get tomorrow afternoon? It's how hot will it stay tonight? And to understand why that question hits differently now than it did 30 years ago, I need to take you to a specific week in a specific city, a week that killed 700 people and that this country has mostly forgotten. Part 4, Behind Locked Doors. Thursday, July 13th, 1995. Chicago. The afternoon temperature hits 106 degrees Fahrenheit. The heat index, factoring in the humidity that was sitting over the city like a wet towel, reaches 126. Both numbers are awful. Neither one is what did the killing. Night falls. The temperature doesn't. Overnight lows hold in the upper 70s and lower 80s. For most healthy people with functioning air conditioning, that registers as uncomfortable. For the elderly, the isolated, anyone in a building without working cooling, it is a death sentence that takes approximately 72 hours to execute. And the grid is failing. Commonwealth Edison's transformers are overheating, blown by the sustained load of air conditioners that won't cycle down because there's no overnight respite. Power goes out in neighborhoods across the city, tens of thousands of homes, then hundreds of thousands. The people who had air conditioning no longer do. The demand that was supposed to drop after 10 p.m. never drops. And the grid, designed around the assumption that nightfall brings relief, buckles under a night that offers none. Eric Kleinenberg, the sociologist who later wrote what he called a social autopsy of the disaster, described the distinctive character of this heat wave. It didn't get cool at night, Kleinenberg said. It stayed up in the 80s. There was nowhere for people to turn for relief, especially because the power went out in hundreds of thousands of homes. They couldn't even turn on the AC. So picture this, and I want you to actually build the scene in your head because the details matter. You are 78 years old. You live alone in a brick 3 flat on the south side. The building, brick, no insulation, flat tar roof, has been absorbing heat since 6 a.m. for 3 consecutive days. By midnight, the interior walls are warm to the touch. The power is out. No fan, no air conditioning, nothing moving the air. You are afraid to open the windows because crime in the neighborhood is high and you have been afraid for years. Your windows are locked. Your door is locked. You are dying, slowly, of hyperthermia behind sealed windows in a building that is functionally a kiln. And nobody knows because nobody has checked on you in days. 739. That is the number of additional deaths above the weekly average that the city eventually counted. A peer-reviewed analysis by Kaiser and colleagues estimated 692 excess deaths using a different methodology. Both figures are defensible. What they converge on is the scale. A modern American city lost something close to 700 people in a single week, more than the Great Chicago Fire of 1871. And the toll was not evenly distributed. 73% of the dead were over 65. Black residents died at significantly higher rates than white residents. The city's institutional response collapsed. The mayor was on vacation. The health commissioner was on vacation. The fire commissioner was on vacation. When Mayor Daley finally addressed the toll, he said something that captures the institutional blindness at the center of this investigation. He said, "It's hot. It's very hot. But let's not blow it out of proportion." 700 people. Don't blow it out of proportion. The social autopsy reveals something beyond institutional failure. And this is where Kleinenberg's work becomes essential. The dead weren't randomly distributed across Chicago. They were concentrated in neighborhoods with specific, identifiable characteristics. High rates of elderly people living alone, crime severe enough to keep windows sealed, low social cohesion that meant nobody knocked on the door for days. Many of the dead were discovered only when neighbors noticed the smell. The medical examiner's office ran out of space and brought in refrigerated trucks to hold the bodies, a detail that would repeat in different cities in different decades as the overnight cooling window kept narrowing. And the toll fell along racial lines that Kleinenberg documented meticulously. Black residents died at significantly higher rates. The neighborhoods where the dying concentrated were the same neighborhoods disinvested for decades. Denser housing stock, less tree canopy, more heat-absorbing pavement, fewer community institutions that might have organized welfare checks. The geography of heat death mapped onto the geography of abandonment. That thread comes back later in this investigation, and when it does, it comes back with a data set that will make the connection explicit. Chicago learned. Eventually, the city overhauled its heat response protocols. Subsequent waves killed fewer, about 114 in 1999, 22 in 2012. The per capita death rate dropped because the system changed, but the buildings that killed in 1995 are still standing. The bricks that absorbed that heat are still absorbing it today, and the trend line, nights warming faster, cities growing denser, populations aging, means the atmospheric conditions that created the disaster are becoming more frequent, not less. Part 5. The Invisible Acceleration. There is a number buried in NOAA's climate monitoring data that most Americans have never seen. It doesn't appear on weather apps. It doesn't lead newscasts. When I first pulled it up, I sat with it for a while before I understood what it was actually telling me. Since 1900, U.S. overnight minimum temperatures have warmed at 1.45 degrees Fahrenheit per century. Daytime maximums have warmed at 1.13 degrees Fahrenheit per century. Read those two numbers again because they are doing a lot of quiet work. The gap means nights are warming roughly 28% faster than days across the country, but the long-term average actually understates what's happening now. Climate Central analyzed summer specifically, the season where it matters most, and found summer minimum temperatures across the U.S. have warmed at 1.64 degrees Fahrenheit per century since 1895, nearly twice the rate of summer daytime highs. Since 1970, when the warming rate accelerated sharply, summer nights have gotten hotter in 231 out of 247 analyzed cities. That's 96% of American cities. The average increase, 3.1 degrees Fahrenheit. In the Southwest, it's 4.5. And here's where the picture sharpens into something genuinely alarming. In 2022, 66% of the contiguous United States by land area experienced extremely warm summer nights. Only 28% experienced extremely warm summer days. 102 counties set records for their hottest summer nights that year. Only 19 set records for hottest summer days. The nighttime signal isn't just outpacing the daytime signal, it's running away from it. Climate Central built a tool called the Climate Shift Index that quantifies how much human-caused warming has made a specific temperature event more likely. During the first half of July 2022, 86% of the U.S. population experienced nighttime lows made at least twice as likely by climate change. For daytime highs over the same window, that number was 20%, 86 versus 20. The fingerprint of climate change is not evenly distributed across the day. It is concentrated after dark. The mechanism makes intuitive sense once you see it plainly. Greenhouse gases trap outgoing radiation, heat leaving the surface headed for space. During the day, the sun is pouring energy in, so the trapping effect is a fraction of a much larger flow. At night, there's no incoming solar energy. The surface is only losing heat, and the greenhouse blanket catches a proportionally larger share of that outgoing energy. Think of it this way. During the day, you're trying to hold back a river with a net. At night, you're holding back a creek. The net catches more of the creek. Add humidity, which is itself increasing, and the blanket gets thicker. Add cloud cover, which reflects outgoing infrared right back to the surface, and it gets thicker still. Then add the urban heat island. Because the temperature difference between a city and its surrounding countryside reaches its maximum not at noon, not at 3 in the afternoon, but 3 to 5 hours after sunset. That's when rural land cools rapidly, and the city, asphalt, concrete, brick, keeps bleeding stored heat into the air. 3 forces: greenhouse trapping, rising humidity. The urban heat island. All 3 push hardest at night. They interact, they compound, and they are all accelerating. And the scale of the urban heat island at night is something that genuinely surprised me when I dug into it. The EPA's data shows that on average, nighttime temperatures in cities run 2 to 5 degrees Fahrenheit hotter than surrounding rural areas. That's the average. But other authorities, Calipe, UCAR, document that under certain conditions, calm nights with clear skies, the difference can reach as much as 22 degrees Fahrenheit. Think about what that means. You and a person 20 miles outside the city are experiencing the same night under the same sky, and your air temperature is potentially 22 degrees hotter. Not because the climate is different, because the materials under your feet are different. And we can see this now. Not infer it, see it. NASA's EcoStress instrument, mounted on the International Space Station, measures land surface temperature at 70-meter resolution, block by block, street by street. On June 20th, 2022, EcoStress captured Houston just after sunrise at 6:29 a.m. Urban surfaces and roads were still up to 18 degrees Fahrenheit hotter than the outskirts. That's after a full night of supposed cooling. The city's concrete and asphalt had been releasing stored heat for hours, and by dawn, they were still running nearly 20 degrees above the surrounding land. In Las Vegas, dark streets measured by EcoStress exceeded 122 degrees Fahrenheit, while green spaces like golf courses sat 23 degrees cooler. In Phoenix, surfaces near Sky Harbor Airport, the same station that recorded that 97-degree low, reached around 140 degrees Fahrenheit when the air temperature was 106. Glenn Hulley, a climate researcher at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory, called those maps a vital tool for planning heat interventions, like tree planting that can cool down the hottest roads and sidewalks. The dark surfaces are the engine. Per NASA JPL, asphalt absorbs up to 95% of incoming solar radiation and retains the heat for hours into the night. 95%. The road under your car isn't just a surface. It's a thermal battery that charges all day and discharges all night, directly into the air your neighborhood is trying to sleep in. The English meteorologist Luke Howard documented a nighttime temperature difference of about 3.7 degrees Fahrenheit between central London and the countryside back in the 1810s and 1820s. The phenomenon is not new. What's new is the scale of American cities, the density of the asphalt, and the pace at which the background climate is loading the dice in favor of nights that refuse to cool. 2 centuries of urban expansion laid over a warming atmosphere. The result is a ratchet that only turns one direction after dark. This is the story no afternoon forecast can tell you. And it's why 140 million people in the 90s this week should be asking a question almost nobody is asking. Not how hot will it get tomorrow, but how cool will it get tonight? Because the answer to that question has already changed, quietly, over decades, in ways most Americans haven't noticed. The cooling window that human biology depends on, that the power grid depends on, that every heat emergency plan in every city was calibrated against, that window is narrowing, and the consequences extend beyond physiology, beyond individual deaths. They reach into the infrastructure holding everything together, into the grid, into the concrete, into a pattern of investment and neglect that was drawn literally on maps nearly a century ago. And here is where the 2 threads of this investigation converge. Because the neighborhoods where nights run hottest are not random. They were chosen, deliberately, decades ago, by people with red pens, drawing lines around the blocks they decided didn't deserve investment. Those red lines determined where trees were planted and where they weren't, where pavement replaced soil, where density climbed and canopy vanished. And today, right now, those red lines are still radiating heat. Part 6, the red lines that still radiate. I ended the last section by telling you that the neighborhoods where nights run hottest were chosen. That's not rhetoric, it's data. And the study that proved it is one of the most precise pieces of urban climate science I've come across. In 2020, Jeremy Hoffman, then the chief scientist at the Science Museum of Virginia, along with Vivek Chandas of Portland State University and Crystal Pendleton, published a study in the journal Climate that did something no one had done at scale before. They overlaid satellite-derived land surface temperature maps onto historical redlining maps from the 1930s, the maps drawn by the Homeowners Loan Corporation that graded neighborhoods A through D, where D meant hazardous and was outlined in red. Those red lines determined which neighborhoods received federally backed mortgages and which didn't, which neighborhoods got investment, which got abandoned. Hoffman and his colleagues examined 108 U.S. urban areas, and in 94% of them, all but 7, the formerly redline neighborhoods were measurably hotter. Not by a degree or 2, by as much as roughly 13 degrees Fahrenheit. On average, D-graded areas ran about 2.6 degrees Celsius warmer than A-graded areas. That's roughly 4.7 degrees Fahrenheit of difference, drawn with a pen in 1937, still radiating in 2025. Minneapolis, Portland, Denver. Those three cities showed the largest differentials, more than 10 degrees Fahrenheit, between the red line zones and the neighborhoods that received investment. And Hoffman said something about the spatial pattern that I haven't been able to shake. He said, all these cities, when you look at them, it's almost surgical. You look along one little road and you can know exactly where the redlining happened. Almost surgical. You can see the line and you can see it from space. Remember the eco-stress instrument I mentioned earlier, NASA's thermal camera on the International Space Station, reading surface temperatures at 70-meter resolution? When researchers overlay eco-stress heat maps onto the same HOLC redlining maps, the correspondence is eerie. The hottest pixels cluster inside the red lines. The coolest pixels align with the green, the A-graded neighborhoods that got the loans, got the trees, got the parks. 90 years later, the thermal signature of a bureaucrat's pen is still legible from orbit. The mechanism isn't mysterious. The neighborhoods marked D were denied municipal services and support for home ownership for decades. As Shondas put it, these areas were denied investment during the mid-20th century, and they now contain the hottest areas in almost every one of the 108 cities studied. What does disinvestment look like in thermal terms? Less tree canopy. In some redline neighborhoods, canopy coverage is below 5%, where adjacent A-graded neighborhoods sit at 30 or 40%. Fewer parks. More impervious surface, concrete, asphalt, dark-colored rooftops absorbing energy all day and bleeding it into the air all night. Denser housing stock built cheap, without insulation, packed close together. Every one of those factors amplifies the urban heat island. Every one of them concentrates heat retention after dark. And this is where the two threads of the investigation twist together. Because the overnight warming trend I showed you, nights heating nearly twice as fast as days, doesn't land evenly across a city. It lands heaviest in the neighborhoods with the most pavement, the least canopy, the densest housing, the neighborhoods drawn in red. The people living in those zones aren't experiencing the city average overnight low. They're experiencing something measurably worse. And they're disproportionately low income, disproportionately elderly, disproportionately people of color, the same populations that Chicago's social autopsy identified as the ones who die behind locked doors when the night doesn't cool. This isn't a historical footnote. It's a live thermal inequality built into the physical infrastructure of American cities, compounding every summer night. And it means that national statistics about overnight warming actually understate the danger for the people most at risk, because those statistics average across entire metro areas. The people in the red line zones aren't experiencing the average. They're experiencing the tail. I want to sit with that for a moment before moving on, because what it means is that the crisis of nighttime heat is not just a climate story. It is a climate story layered on top of a civil rights story, layered on top of an infrastructure story. The same decisions that denied wealth, that denied shade, denied green space, denied building quality, are now denying survivable nights. The thermal debt compounds the financial debt, and neither one has been paid. If you watched our investigation 2 weeks ago on the drought footprint across the western United States, you saw the same compound dynamic, a slow-moving stressor that institutional planning has consistently underestimated. The overnight heat problem has the same character. It's not a single event. It's a trend, and the trend is steepest in the communities that were set up to fail by decisions made before anyone alive today was born. Now, I told you earlier that Chicago was a cautionary tale from this continent, but the deadliest overnight heat disaster in modern Western history didn't happen here. It happened across the Atlantic, and the thing that makes it essential to this investigation isn't the death toll, although the toll is staggering. It's the mechanism. Because France in 2003 is the clearest case study in the world of what happens when an entire built environment is designed for a climate that no longer exists. Part 7, the buildings designed for a dead climate, August 2003, Western Europe, an anticyclone, a massive dome of high pressure, parks over France and refuses to move. For more than a week, temperatures across the country stay above 40 degrees Celsius. In the town of Auxerre, they hold there for 8 consecutive days. In the Paris region, maximum temperatures hover between 36 and 37 degrees Celsius for nearly 2 weeks straight. Those numbers alone would be dangerous. But it's what happens at night that turns the crisis into a catastrophe. Even the nighttime temperatures exceeded the average summer midday highs. Read that sentence again. The coolest the air got at 3 in the morning was hotter than a normal July afternoon. The entire concept of diurnal cooling, the day-night temperature swing that every European city was built around, that every stone apartment building in Paris was designed to exploit, collapsed. And you have to understand the cultural context to grasp why the toll was so devastating. August in France is les vacances. The country empties. Families leave the cities for the coast, for the countryside, for anywhere that isn't Paris in summer. And who stays behind? The elderly, the people who can't travel, the people whose families are scattered. The social infrastructure that might notice a neighbor hasn't been seen in 3 days. It's on vacation too. And here's the part that connects France to every American city sitting under this week's heat dome. French buildings were engineered for a temperate continental climate. Thick stone walls, heavy masonry, concrete floors, materials chosen because they absorb heat during the day and release it slowly at night, moderating indoor temperatures through what architects call thermal mass. In the climate those buildings were designed for, this works beautifully. The walls absorb the modest daytime heat, the cool night air draws it out, and by morning the interior is comfortable again. But in the climate of August 2003, the climate of repeated days above 40 degrees with nights that never fell below the old afternoon average, thermal mass became a weapon. The walls absorbed heat they couldn't shed. Night after night, the stone accumulated more energy than the meager cooling window could extract. By the 5th day, interior temperatures in top-floor apartments were exceeding 40 degrees Celsius around the clock. The buildings weren't sheltering their occupants, they were cooking them. France recorded approximately 14,800 excess deaths. Santé Publique, France, and the National Health Research Institute INSERM confirmed the toll. At the peak, around August 12th, excess mortality was climbing to roughly 2,000 additional deaths per day, a 60% increase above expected mortality at the height of the event. In the Paris area alone, excess mortality reached 142% above baseline. In a city of sophisticated healthcare, advanced infrastructure, and centuries of civilization, twice as many people were dying as expected, every single day for more than a week. The Van den Toren Case Control Study in 2006 dissected the risk factors with a precision that belongs in this investigation. Using Landsat satellite thermal imagery to map surface temperatures around each victim's home, they identified 3 things that predicted death: lack of thermal insulation in the building, sleeping on the top floor directly beneath the roof, the floor where hot air pools, and the roof, baked all day, radiates heat straight down through the ceiling like a broiler, and the urban heat island intensity around the home. Being confined to bed, unable to move yourself to a cooler room, a lower floor, an open window, carried an odds ratio of 7.52. Your risk of dying was more than 7 times higher if you couldn't move. I keep thinking about the top floor detail. Imagine yourself there. You're 83. You've lived in a 5th floor walk-up in the 11th arrondissement for 40 years. Stone walls, small windows, no air conditioning. There's never been a need. For 4 decades, the stone kept you cool. And now the stone is keeping you warm. The walls are radiating. The ceiling is radiating. You are lying in bed in a room that is above 40 degrees Celsius at midnight, and the physics of thermal mass that served your parents and your grandparents is killing you. The building hasn't changed. The climate has. Morgues overflowed. Bodies were stored in a refrigerated warehouse, requisitioned outside Paris, a space normally used for food logistics, pressed into service because the city's infrastructure for handling death couldn't keep pace with the rate of dying. Parisians returning from August vacations discovered their elderly neighbors had died alone. Some were found only because bodily fluids had seeped through ceilings into the apartments below. Emergency physician Dr. Patrick Pelouse publicly blamed the government's slow response, and his outrage triggered investigations that reshaped French public health permanently. And here's the part of this story that matters most for what's happening right now. France learned. In 2004, the government launched the National Heatwave Plan, an alert system with mandatory institutional response protocols, outreach to isolated elderly, pre-positioned cooling resources. And it worked. During the 2019 European heatwave, which brought comparable temperatures across much of France, the excess death toll was approximately 1,462, roughly a 90% reduction from 2003. That is one of the most dramatic public health improvements in modern disaster history. A country that lost nearly 15,000 people to heat in a single event was able 15 years later to hold the toll to under 1,500 under similar conditions. The difference was not meteorological. The heat was comparable. The difference was institutional. The system learned to see the nights, to check on the isolated, to intervene before the physiology crossed the point of no return. Mathilde Pascal, a researcher at Santé Publique France, said something about the 2003 disaster that I think is the most important framing in this entire section. She said, "For me, 2003, it's really like something that comes from the future and says you must get ready because I'm going to come back." Something from the future, telling you it's coming back. That's the question for every American city sitting under rising overnight lows this week. France's buildings were designed for a climate that vanished. Are ours any different? Phoenix says 99% of homes have central air conditioning, but 85% of the AC units in homes where people died indoors had failed. Chicago's Brick 3 flats, the same building stock that killed in 1995, are still standing. The row houses of Philadelphia, the brownstones of Brooklyn, the concrete apartment towers of Houston, they were all designed with a set of assumptions about what night would feel like. And those assumptions are dissolving. France proved two things simultaneously. It proved that the failure of overnight cooling in a built environment designed for a different climate is catastrophic. And it proved that a competent institutional response can cut the death toll by 90%. Both facts are true. Both matter. The question for America is which lesson we learn and whether we learn it before or after the catastrophe. And this is where the story takes a turn that most coverage completely misses. Because the building isn't the only system designed around an assumption of overnight cooling that the climate is quietly revoking. There's another one, bigger, more consequential. It serves tens of millions of people at once, and every city in the country depends on it every minute of every hot night. When it fails during a heat wave, the modeling says the consequences are almost beyond imagining. Part 8, the tool that finally counts the night before I take you into the grid, I need to show you something the National Weather Service built, because it represents the first time the institution officially acknowledged the gap this entire investigation is about. For decades, the primary heat warning products issued by the NWS, heat advisories, excessive heat warnings, were calibrated almost exclusively around the daytime heat index. The thresholds vary by region and by how acclimatized the local population is. In the Central Plains, an excessive heat warning typically requires a heat index around 105 degrees. In Florida's Panhandle and central regions, a heat advisory isn't issued until the heat index exceeds 108, and excessive heat warnings don't trigger until 113. The numbers are different because the populations are different. What's dangerous in Minneapolis is Tuesday in Tampa. But there was a hole in this system. The NWS itself acknowledged it. In most heat index-based warning approaches, the impacts of excessively warm nights were not considered. That's not my characterization. That's theirs. So they built something new. It's called heat risk, and it's a 5-category index, color-coded green through magenta, that does something no previous NWS product did. It combines daytime highs and overnight lows into a single risk assessment. It accounts for how unusual the heat is for the specific location and date, whether temperatures are in the top 5% for that calendar day. It factors in the duration of the event, how many consecutive days the heat persists. It incorporates time of year because a 95-degree day in April, before bodies have acclimatized, is far more dangerous than the same temperature in August. And it integrates CDC heat health mortality data. Heat risk was available in the western United States starting in 2014 and expanded nationwide in 2024. And the reason I'm spending time on it is not because it's interesting, although it is, but because its existence is an institutional admission that the old system was blind to the danger this investigation is tracking. The nights weren't being counted. Now they are. That matters. The scale itself tells you how the thinking is shifted. Green means little to no risk from heat. Yellow means minor risk for sensitive populations. Orange, and this is where it starts getting real, means an elevated risk where heat-sensitive individuals could be affected. Red flags a major risk with impacts likely across broader populations. And magenta, the highest level, signals an extremely rare and dangerous heat event, the kind where even healthy people with access to cooling are at risk if they're exposed for prolonged periods. When you see magenta on the heat risk map, the tool is telling you the combination of daytime heat and overnight persistence is in historic territory for that location and date. The nights are doing half the work in that calculation, and for the first time, they're officially on the map. But the tool is only as useful as the infrastructure behind it. Several NWS offices in New England, New York, the Texas and Oklahoma panhandles have recently lowered their heat warning thresholds, partly in response to mounting evidence that lower magnitude heat kills when it persists across multiple nights. Some offices now explicitly incorporate overnight minimum criteria into their warning decisions. That's new. A decade ago, the overnight low was a footnote. Now it's a trigger. And there's a parallel measurement, the wet bulb globe temperature, that accounts for temperature, humidity, wind, and sun angle. The NWS notes it's designed primarily for outdoor labor and athletics. Military training, construction, sports. It's less useful for the heat-sensitive homebound populations who account for most heat deaths. The gap between the tool built for workers in the field and the assessment needed for a 78-year-old in a fourth-floor walk-up is another version of the same blind spot. And then there's the satellite-level view. You can pull this up yourself. Heat.gov, the National Integrated Heat Health Information System. NOAA runs community science urban heat island mapping campaigns in more than 60 American cities, where volunteers drive instrumented cars along predetermined routes on the hottest days of summer, recording block-by-block temperature variations, morning routes, afternoon routes, evening routes. The evening traverses are the ones that reveal the nighttime danger, because they capture the heat that's still radiating off pavement and buildings hours after the sun goes down. The data from those campaigns confirms exactly what Hoffman's redlining study showed from orbit. The hottest blocks and the most underserved blocks are overwhelmingly the same blocks. The volunteers driving through formerly redlined neighborhoods measure surface temperatures that are measurably, consistently higher than the neighborhoods half a mile away that received investment 80 years ago. And the difference peaks in the evening when the pavement is bleeding its stored heat into the air of neighborhoods that have the fewest trees, the least reflective surfaces, and the most vulnerable residents. So the tools exist. The data exists. The institutional acknowledgement embodied in heat risk exists. The community-level evidence exists. The question is whether the response system, the cooling centers, the outreach programs, the building codes, the grid can keep pace with a trend that is accelerating fastest precisely in the hours when most of the response system closes for the night. And that question brings us to the compound threat, the scenario that Brian Stone Jr. at Georgia Tech calls, and I'm going to quote him directly because the precision of his language matters, probably the greatest climate-related hazard we can imagine. Part 9, when the grid goes dark. Everything I've shown you so far assumes the power stays on. That is not a safe assumption, and the research that proves it is the most disturbing data set in this investigation. The normal electrical grid operates on a daily rhythm that mirrors the human bodies. During the day, demand surges, air conditioners running, commercial buildings cooling, industrial processes consuming, the full weight of a hot afternoon pressing on generation capacity. Grid operators spin up peaking plants, gas turbines in most regions that exist solely for these afternoon hours, reserves thin, transmission lines which lose carrying capacity as they heat up and sag, run closer to their thermal limits. But then night comes. Demand drops. Air conditioners cycle down. Commercial buildings empty out. The grid exhales. Operators take the peakers offline. Maintenance crews go out to repair aging transformers and patch transmission problems that couldn't be addressed under full load. Battery storage systems recharge. The whole system rebuilds the margin it burned through during the afternoon. That nightly exhale isn't a convenience, it's structural. The entire grid planning model assumes it happens. Reserve margins, maintenance schedules, equipment lifetimes, transmission ratings, all calibrated to a world where demand drops significantly after sunset. Now erase the trough. Hold overnight temperatures at 90 degrees, 95. The air conditioners never cycle down. Residential demand stays pinned at levels that are supposed to last 6 hours, running for 18 instead. The maintenance window vanishes. Crews can't pull transformers offline when the load won't drop. Battery storage depletes and can't fully recharge because there's no surplus generation to fill them. The nightly exhale doesn't happen, and the grid enters the next afternoon already depleted, less reserve, less maintenance headroom, more thermal stress on conductors and transformers that were supposed to get a reprieve they never received. This is not an abstract concern for the 140 million Americans under heat this week. Remember, PJM interconnection. The operator serving 67 million people across 13 states and DC. Their summer outlook expects a peak around 156,000 megawatts against roughly 180,000 megawatts of capacity. That looks like margin. But PJM's models, like every grid operator's models, assume the daily load curve drops at night. They assume the overnight minimum temperature allows the demand trough to form. If the overnight lows in the mid-Atlantic stay in the upper 70s and low 80s, which is exactly what happens when a heat dome stalls over the East Coast, that assumed trough compresses. The margin that looked comfortable at 3 in the afternoon looks very different at 3 in the morning, when the demand that should have fallen to 70% of peak is still running at 85. ERCOT, the grid operator for most of Texas, maintains a target minimum reserve margin of 13.75%. They've issued conservation appeals dozens of times since 2008. During the July 2022 heat wave, ERCOT asked Texans to conserve from 2 to 8 p.m. as demand hit records and wind generation fell below 10% of capacity. By summer 2025, ERCOT managed a preliminary peak demand record of about 85,559 megawatts without conservation appeals, crediting rapid additions of solar and battery storage, more than 11,000 megawatts of new capacity since the prior winter. That's a real adaptation success. I want to acknowledge it honestly, but the margin between success and failure on the Texas grid remains narrower than most people realize, and the overnight demand pattern is the variable that determines whether reserves hold or collapse. Now take what I've just described and layer the worst case on top of it. That's what Brian Stone Jr. did. Stone directs the Urban Climate Lab at Georgia Institute of Technology. Working with researchers at Arizona State University and the University of Michigan, he published the 3 heat study in Environmental Science and Technology in 2023. And what they modeled was the scenario nobody wants to think about, a multi-day power failure coinciding with a heat wave. They didn't use a future climate projection. That's critical. They used a historical analog, the 2006 Phoenix heat wave, when afternoon temperatures averaged 113 degrees for 5 consecutive days. Overnight lows during that event stayed in the 90s. They modeled a blackout beginning on day 1. Total grid failure across the metro, with power gradually restored over the next 4 days, so that by day 5, electricity was back, but the population had endured roughly 48 hours of complete darkness, followed by partial restoration during the hottest sustained stretch of the year. They ran the health impact model across 3 cities with dramatically different infrastructure and acclimatization profiles: Phoenix, Atlanta, and Detroit. The Phoenix numbers stopped me cold. Roughly 816,570 people, approximately half the city's population, would require emergency medical care, and roughly 13,250 people would die from heat alone in a single event in a city with one of the most advanced heat response systems in the country, And here's the paradox that makes the finding genuinely frightening. Phoenix's death toll was proportionally the worst of the three cities, not despite having the best air conditioning penetration, but because of it. Phoenix has central AC in about 99% of homes. Atlanta sits at 94%. Detroit at 53%. The near total dependence on mechanical cooling in Phoenix means the population has almost no physiological acclimatization to ambient heat. Their bodies have spent years in 72-degree indoor environments while the outside air sat at 115. The sweat response is unconditioned. The cardiovascular adaptations that would help someone in a less air-conditioned city, increased plasma volume, more efficient vasodilation, earlier onset of sweating, never developed. When the AC works, everyone is fine. When it fails, almost nobody has the biological capacity to cope. The system that protects them is also the system that makes them fragile. I want to name that clearly because it's one of the most counterintuitive findings in this entire investigation. More air conditioning makes a population safer on every normal day and more vulnerable on the day the air conditioning fails. The safety and the fragility come from the same source. And in a city where the overnight low is 97 degrees, the failure of that source is not hypothetical. It happened in 85% of the indoor death cases in Phoenix in 2023. Not because the power grid failed, because individual units failed under sustained load. Detroit, with its lower AC penetration, would see death rates roughly double during a blackout event. Atlanta, similar, but Phoenix, 700% increase. 700. Because the city has been engineered around a single point of failure, and the single point of failure is the grid. Stone told the New York Times something I keep returning to. He said, "I describe this as probably the greatest climate-related hazard we can imagine, a blackout during a heat wave." And he stressed that these projections are grounded in today's climate reality, not future warming scenarios, not models of what might happen in 2050. Today, the temperatures in the model have already been observed. The only variable that hasn't occurred is the blackout happening simultaneously, and blackouts are not hypothetical. Stone's team documented that major U.S. power outages roughly doubled, a 60% rise over the prior 5-year period, between 2015 through 2016 and 2020 through 2021. The causes vary: aging infrastructure, severe weather, demand spikes, cyber attacks. But the trend is clear and the timing is alarming. The frequency of major outages is increasing at the same time that the consequences of an outage during heat are escalating, because overnight temperatures are rising and physiological acclimatization is declining. 3 trends, all heading the same direction, all converging on the same vulnerability. The mitigations Stone identified are achingly practical. Shading half of city streets with tree canopy would reduce heat deaths during a blackout by 27% in Phoenix. Cool roofs, reflective surface materials that bounce solar energy back instead of absorbing it, would cut Phoenix deaths by 66%, 2/3, from white paint and reflective membranes. These aren't speculative technologies requiring decades of development. They're trees and white paint. They exist, they're affordable, and they would save thousands of lives in exactly the scenario the models show is coming. But here's what keeps me up. Cooling centers, the primary institutional response to extreme heat in most American cities, are often not required to have backup generators. Stone's team found this was true in cities including Atlanta and Detroit. Think about the logic. The plan for surviving extreme heat is to open public buildings where people can cool down. But the scenario that would make those buildings most essential, a blackout during a heat wave, is also the scenario that renders them useless. A cooling center without power during a blackout is just another hot building with plastic chairs. The contingency plan has the same single point of failure as the homes it's supposed to rescue people from. So here's where we are. A physiological system that requires overnight cooling to survive multi-day heat. A climate trend that is eroding overnight cooling nearly twice as fast as daytime warming. An urban form, asphalt, concrete, the physical legacy of redlining that amplifies the erosion precisely when it matters most, after dark. A warning system that only recently learned to count the nights. A a grid that depends on the same overnight cooling window the human body does, and that enters each successive afternoon more depleted when that window fails. In a peer-reviewed modeling study, grounded in temperatures that have already been observed in a city that already exists, showing that the compound failure of heat and power produces casualties on a scale this country has not experienced from any natural hazard in modern memory. Those aren't separate stories. They are one story, one mechanism, the collapse of the overnight cooling window running like a fault line through human physiology, urban infrastructure, historical injustice, and electrical engineering. And the story is not theoretical. It's playing out right now in the 7 consecutive record-breaking death tolls in Maricopa County, in the mortality data from 178 locations across 44 countries, in the overnight lows along the Gulf Coast setting records this spring that your weather app probably didn't mention. The question remaining, and it's the question that drives everything in the second half of this investigation, is what the trajectory looks like from here. How the researchers who've spent their careers on this interpret the same evidence. Where they agree. Where they argue. What the most optimistic reading actually looks like when you examine it honestly. What the most concerning reading implies for cities that haven't done what France did, that haven't built what Phoenix is building, that are still running heat response plans designed for a climate that is retreating into the past. And there's a claim you'll find in comment sections and on certain corners of the internet, a claim that the warming trend is nothing more than an artifact of sensors sitting too close to parking lots, that the urban heat island explains away the entire global temperature record. That claim deserves a direct physics-based answer, and the answer is more interesting than the claim. Part 10, what the next event looks like. Everything I've built in this investigation so far has been about establishing the mechanism, proving that overnight cooling is collapsing, that nights are warming faster than days, that the urban heat island peaks after dark, that the grid and the human body share the same fatal dependency on a cooling window that's narrowing. Now I need to turn the lens forward, because the implications of this mechanism applied to the population and infrastructure currently sitting under 140 million Americans worth of summer heat are specific enough to name. Start in the Southwest. Phoenix has already shown you the frontier, 97-degree overnight lows, 7 consecutive years of record heat deaths, 85% AC failure rates among indoor fatalities. But Phoenix at least knows what it's facing. The city has built a 24/7 respite center. It has a network of more than 200 cooling facilities. It has David Hondula running an office of heat response and mitigation, one of the first dedicated positions of its kind in the country. Phoenix is losing the fight, but it's fighting. The rest of the Southwest? Climate Central's data shows summer nighttime warming of 4.5 degrees Fahrenheit across the region since 1970, the highest rate in the country. Las Vegas, Tucson, Albuquerque, the Inland Empire of Southern California, these are cities where overnight lows are climbing into the 80s and 90s during summer heat events, where development is sprawling into desert terrain that amplifies the heat island, and where the populations are growing fast enough that the infrastructure of cooling, grid capacity, AC installation, shade canopy is perpetually running behind the demand. Stone's modeling was done for Phoenix, but the physics applies to every city in this corridor. The question is not whether these cities face the same compound vulnerability, it's how far behind they are in recognizing it. Now look east, the Gulf Coast, Brownsville lows in the lower 80s, Key West at 84 overnight, 11 nighttime records in May alone. These are cities where humidity compounds the heat in a way the desert doesn't produce. In dry Phoenix, sweat evaporates. It works. The body's cooling mechanism functions until the temperature is simply too high. Along the Gulf, the air is already saturated. Sweat beads and drips but doesn't evaporate, and the body gets no cooling benefit from the effort. The wet bulb temperature, the metric that captures how effectively you can shed heat through evaporation, runs higher in Houston at 92 degrees with 80% humidity than it does in Phoenix at 110 with 15% humidity. And the Gulf Coast cities don't have Phoenix's awareness. The heat emergency infrastructure along the Texas coast, the Florida Panhandle, the Louisiana parishes, it's built for hurricane season, not for 2-week overnight heat events that never trigger dramatic enough numbers to make national news. People die quietly, one at a time, in apartments with window units that can't overcome the humidity, in mobile homes with thin walls and minimal insulation that conduct heat like a tin can in the sun, in neighborhoods where the overnight low hasn't dropped below 80 in a week and nobody's issued a warning because the daytime high only hit 94, which doesn't cross the local advisory threshold. This is where the disconnect between what the warning system measures and what the body experiences is widest. A daytime high of 94 in Corpus Christi doesn't sound alarming. It sounds like summer, but combine it with an overnight low of 82 and humidity that never drops below 70%, and the wet bulb temperature at 3 a.m. can sit in the upper 20s Celsius, close enough to the empirical physiological limits that an elderly person without AC is in genuine danger. And none of that triggers an excessive heat warning under most regional thresholds. The system sees 94. The body experiences something far worse. Then look at the Northeast, the population under the heat dome right now. New York, Philadelphia, Boston, Washington. These are cities where the housing stock is old, dense, and in many neighborhoods not air-conditioned. The brownstones and row houses absorb heat through brick and stone and hold it, the same thermal mass mechanism that killed in Paris. The subway platforms function as underground heat traps, and the populations include millions of elderly people in walk-up apartments with no elevator, no AC, and in many cases, no one checking on them. I spent time earlier on the France case study because of how precisely its mechanism maps onto these cities. The same stone and masonry that made Parisian apartments deadly in 2003 exists in the row houses of Philadelphia's Kensington, in the pre-war buildings of the South Bronx, in the triple-deckers of Dorchester. These structures were designed for a climate with cool nights. They are beautiful examples of passive thermal design for the world that built them, and they are increasingly dangerous in the world that's arriving. Here's the part that rarely gets said plainly. Many of these northeastern cities have never experienced a sustained multi-day heat event where the overnight low stays above 85 degrees for more than 2 or 3 nights running. Their emergency plans, their cooling center networks, their public messaging, all of it was designed for the historical baseline. The Climate Central data shows these cities are warming at night. Boston's summer nights have warmed over 3 degrees Fahrenheit since 1970. Philadelphia's are similar, but the emergency response system was built for the old baseline, and the gap between the trend and the plan widens every year. And unlike Phoenix, where heat awareness is woven into the civic identity, where people know what 115 means, the Northeast treats heat as an inconvenience, not a threat. The cultural framing is different, the institutional readiness is different, and the housing stock in many urban cores is worse, older, denser, less insulated, with less AC penetration than any Sunbelt city. The demographic overlay makes this worse in a way that climate data alone doesn't capture. The United States is aging. The population over 65 is the fastest growing age cohort and will be for the next 2 decades. Older bodies thermoregulate less efficiently, reduce sweat output, slower cardiovascular response, thinner blood volume, higher prevalence of medications that impair heat tolerance. Beta blockers limit the heart rate increase needed to pump blood to the skin. Diuretics reduce the fluid available for sweating. Anticholinergics directly suppress the sweat glands themselves. The Kim study from Japan showed all-cause mortality rising 9 to 10% on hot nights across the general population. For the elderly on these medications, and we're talking about tens of millions of Americans, the risk multiplies in ways the population-level statistics can't fully show you. And the El Niño watch hanging over the summer tilts the probabilities further. NOAA's Climate Prediction Center gives El Niño an 82% chance of emerging by July. El Niño doesn't guarantee a hotter summer everywhere. The teleconnections are regional and messy, but it loads the dice It increases the probability of persistent high-pressure ridges, the kind that park over a region for days and refuse to break, the kind that erase the overnight cooling window, and it's arriving into a baseline that's already elevated, nights already warming at nearly twice the daytime rate, drought across 55% of the country already baking the soil, cities already running hotter after dark than they did a decade ago. I don't know exactly when the next mass casualty overnight heat event will hit an American city. Nobody does. But the components are assembled. The trend line is not ambiguous. And the specific vulnerability, the overnight cooling window that the body, the grid, and the emergency response system all depend on, is narrowing measurably in data you can pull up yourself right now. Part 11, the margin, nobody talks about. There's a way to quantify how close the edge actually is, and it involves a number that most people have never heard of, and a relationship between that number and the clock that almost nobody has mapped. I talked earlier about wet bulb temperature, the reading you get when you wrap a thermometer in a wet cloth and measure how much evaporative cooling the air allows. Sherwood and Huber proposed a theoretical limit of 35 degrees Celsius wet bulb, beyond which a healthy human dies. The Penn State Heat Project, under Daniel Vecellio, found the real-world limit is lower, around 30 to 31 degrees Celsius for young, healthy adults in humid conditions. For the elderly, lower still. For anyone on medications that compromise sweating, lower still. Here's what most people don't realize. The highest wet bulb temperatures regularly observed on Earth are already in the 30 to 31 degrees Celsius range. The Persian Gulf Coast, coastal Pakistan during pre-monsoon humidity, parts of the U.S. Gulf Coast during summer surge events when warm sea surface temperatures pump moisture into stagnant air. We are not decades away from brushing against physiological limits. We are brushing against them now, in specific places, during specific conditions. And the margin is thinnest at night. During the day, direct sunlight adds radiant heat load, but also drives convection. Air circulates. Wind stirs. Thermal updrafts provide at least some mixing. At night, in urban canyons where buildings block what airflow exists and pavement radiates stored heat upward into still air, the atmosphere sits. Humidity builds because the temperature drops just enough to push relative humidity toward saturation without actually producing dew or rain that would scrub heat from the air. You get the worst possible combination: hot, still, humid, enclosed. The wet bulb temperature peaks. The body's cooling margin reaches its thinnest point. Now layer the AC dependence trap onto this. Brian Stone's research showed that Phoenix's near-universal air conditioning created a population with no physiological acclimatization to heat. But this isn't just a Phoenix problem. It's an American problem. A C penetration is above 88% nationally. In every major metro, Houston, Dallas, Atlanta, Miami, Phoenix, it exceeds 90%. An entire civilization has been built on the assumption that mechanical cooling will always be available, and that assumption has a measurable physiological consequence: reduced heat tolerance across the population. The research on acclimatization is clear. A human body exposed to moderate heat over 7 to 14 days develops measurable adaptations: earlier onset of sweating, increased sweat volume, expanded plasma volume, lower resting heart rate during heat exposure. These adaptations can reduce the risk of heat illness by as much as 50%, but they only develop through exposure. A population that spends its summers in 72-degree interiors doesn't develop them, which means that when the power fails, or the AC unit breaks, or the person can't afford to run the unit, they face the heat without the physiological preparation their grandparents would have had. This is the paradox at the heart of the entire investigation. Air conditioning saves lives every single day. It is the most important heat adaptation technology ever invented. And its near universal adoption has created a population-level vulnerability that only becomes visible when the technology fails. The safety is real. The fragility is also real. Both facts inhabit the same system. And the failure doesn't have to be grid-wide. In Phoenix, the grid didn't fail in 2023. There was no blackout. The system stone model didn't happen. What happened was thousands of individual failures, window units that couldn't keep up with the load, central systems with worn compressors that finally quit, units that ran out of refrigerant in the middle of a night when no repair service was available because every HVAC technician in the county was already booked. 85% of the indoor deaths with AC present had non-functioning units. The grid held, the last mile failed. Imagine that pattern in Philadelphia during a sustained event. Old row houses with window units propped in frames that don't seal properly. Compressors running continuously for 72 hours in conditions they weren't rated for. Power strips overloaded. Circuit breakers tripping. And when the unit fails at 2 a.m, the stone walls of the row house, walls that have been absorbing 95-degree air all day, begin radiating heat inward. The same thermal mass mechanism that killed in France. You're not in a blackout. The grid is fine. Your neighbor's AC is humming. But yours has stopped, and the building is now working against you. And the overnight low outside is 84 degrees, and the next repair appointment is 3 days out because demand for HVAC service has overwhelmed every provider in the region. That's not the disaster movie version. That's the quiet version. That's the version that kills one person at a time, in apartments that don't make the news, with causes of death that get classified as cardiac arrest or respiratory failure rather than heat, because the decedent was found indoors and the indoor temperature wasn't measured, and the connection between the overnight low and the failed AC unit and the accumulated thermal stress over 3 nights isn't captured in the medical examiner's standard protocol. I want to flag one more thing about the current moment. And I want to be careful here because I am going to distinguish clearly between what has happened and what is forecast. The early June heat event, the one unfolding right now, is moderate by the standards of what's possible. Heat advisory territory, not excessive heat warning territory for most of the affected area. A cold front is expected to break it early next week. By the metrics most coverage uses, it's a notable warm-up, not a historic event. But there are signals in the forecast models. And I need to stress that these have not verified and may not, suggesting a more intense heat dome could build over the eastern United States later in June. If that materializes, the overnight low question becomes acute for cities from Philadelphia to Boston that have not historically experienced sustained multi-day triple-digit heat. PJM's grid would face a genuine stress test, not the comfortable-looking margin of 156,000 megawatts against 180,000. But the compressed margin that forms when the overnight trough doesn't arrive, and every successive afternoon starts from a higher demand floor. I don't know whether that forecast will verify. The models are suggestive, not definitive, and I'm not going to present a medium-range forecast as settled reality. What I do know is that the baseline vulnerability exists right now, regardless of any single event. The nighttime warming trend is measured. The physiological mechanism is proven. The grid dependency is structural. The ingredients are assembled. The question is timing, not direction. And that direction is what certain voices want to tell you doesn't exist. Part 12, the claim that won't die. I'm going to shift register here because this section requires a different kind of precision. Everything so far has been about proving the mechanism and projecting the implications. This section is about addressing, directly and specifically, a claim that the people in the comments are going to make, and that the people watching this video deserve to hear answered honestly rather than dismissed. There's a persistent argument in the comment sections of climate-related videos and in certain published papers that get cited as though they settled the question that goes like this. The warming trend in the surface temperature record is an artifact of the urban heat island. The sensors, they argue, are sitting next to parking lots and air conditioning exhaust vents. The cities have grown around the weather stations. The warming is local, not global. It's measurement bias, not climate change. I want to address this directly because the people asking deserve an actual answer, not a wave of the hand. And the honest answer turns out to be more interesting than either the claim or the usual rebuttal. The impulse behind the argument is rational, and I mean that, not as a rhetorical concession, but as a genuine acknowledgement. Urban heat islands are real. This entire investigation is built on the fact that they are real and lethal. If you know that cities are hotter than rural areas, and you know that many weather stations are in or near cities, and you know that those stations have been surrounded by progressively more development over the past century. It is not unreasonable to ask whether the thermometers are measuring urbanization rather than climate change. The people asking this question are following a logical chain that starts from a correct premise. The error is in where the chain ends up, not where it starts. Researchers like Anthony Watts and Wei Hak Soon have published claims suggesting that site quality issues and urban encroachment might account for a substantial fraction, perhaps as much as 40% of the recorded warming trend. Here's why the physics doesn't support that conclusion. And I want to walk through this carefully, because the rebuttal isn't a single fact, it's a convergence of independent evidence that all points the same direction. First, NASA and NOAA know about this problem. They've known about it for decades. Their surface temperature products explicitly adjust for it. The methodology homogenizes urban station records against surrounding rural stations. Stations that show anomalous warming relative to their neighbors are corrected or excluded. The adjustments have been published, peer-reviewed, replicated, and scrutinized more than almost any other dataset in science. You can access the raw data and the adjusted data and compare them yourself. The adjustments are transparent. Second, the oceans. 70% of Earth's surface is water. There are no parking lots in the Pacific. Sea surface temperatures are measured by ships, buoys, and satellites that have no urban heat island contamination whatsoever, and they show the same warming trend. The Arctic is warming. Antarctica is losing ice mass. Glaciers on every continent are retreating. None of these are near cities. Third, satellites. Since 1979, satellite instruments have measured atmospheric temperatures from orbit, completely independent of surface stations. The satellite record, maintained by teams at the University of Alabama in Huntsville and remote sensing systems, shows warming consistent with the surface record. The measurement platforms are different. The physics is different. The data converge. Fourth, and this is the one that I think lands hardest, Stanford's Mark Jacobson modeled the urban heat island contribution to global warming directly and found it to be a relatively minor contributor. His words, contrary to what climate skeptics have claimed, greenhouse gases and particulate black carbon cause far more warming. The urban heat island is real. It is measurable. It is not driving the global trend. So let me be precise about this. The people saying it's just the sensors are wrong about the global signal. The warming is real. It's confirmed by oceans and satellites and ice cores and retreating glaciers, and no credible analysis of station data produces a result where UHI explains the trend. But, and this is where I want to give the skeptics something they don't expect, the honest steelman of their argument isn't entirely without substance. Not for the global trend, which is settled beyond serious scientific dispute, but for the local question, the question this entire investigation is actually about. The urban heat island is genuine. It is not a measurement artifact. It is a physical reality that makes cities measurably hotter than their surroundings, especially at night. And if your argument is that the thermometer at Sky Harbor Airport in Phoenix reads higher than a thermometer in the desert 30 miles away, yes, of course it does. That's not evidence of measurement error. That's the danger. The UHI isn't a reason to dismiss the temperature record. It's the mechanism by which the temperature record translates into dead bodies on specific blocks in specific neighborhoods. The distinction matters, and here's how I'd frame it as precisely as I can. The skeptic and the climate scientist are both looking at the urban heat island. The skeptic says, this local effect contaminates the global signal, and the warming trend is an artifact. The scientist says, we've corrected for the local effect in the global dataset, and the global signal stands independently, confirmed by oceans, satellites, ice, and glaciers. Both agree the local effect is real. The disagreement is about what it proves for the global trend, not about whether it exists at the local scale. And for the purposes of this investigation, an investigation about what happens to human beings on specific nights when the air doesn't cool, the local effect is the entire story. The global trend is the force that's making the local effect worse. They're compounding each other, year after year, night after night. There's a second misconception I want to address, because it shows up even more often and it carries real consequences. It's the claim that heat deaths are fundamentally a matter of personal responsibility, that people just need to stay hydrated, stay indoors, use common sense. I hear it in every comment section. I hear it from people who genuinely think they're being helpful. Here's why it's wrong, and the physics is non-negotiable on this. The human body cools itself primarily through evaporating sweat off the skin surface. Evaporation requires a gradient. The air has to be dry enough to accept the moisture. When humidity is high, that gradient narrows. When the combination of temperature and humidity pushes the wet bulb temperature above the body's critical threshold, evaporation effectively stops. Sweat sits on the skin. Core temperature rises, and no amount of fluid intake changes this. You can pour water into a person whose body can't shed heat, and you've addressed dehydration without addressing the problem. The problem is thermodynamic. The environment cannot accept the heat the body needs to dump. Vecellio's work at Penn State tested this empirically. Young, healthy, well-hydrated adults hit their physiological ceiling at wet bulb temperatures well below the theoretical 35-degree limit. For elderly subjects, the thresholds are lower still. And these are controlled laboratory conditions. No radiant heat from pavement, no urban canyon trapping the air, no medications impairing the sweat response. The just drink water framing is not just wrong. It's dangerous because it shifts responsibility from the system to the individual at the exact moment the system is what needs to change. When a 78-year-old woman dies in a top-floor apartment in a red-line neighborhood during a night that never dropped below 83 degrees, the cause of death is not insufficient personal responsibility. The cause of death is a convergence of atmospheric physics, building design, institutional neglect, and a warning system that was measuring the wrong number. Telling her to drink more water is like telling someone in a house fire to breathe more carefully. The advice addresses the wrong problem at the wrong scale. This is why the debunking matters for the investigation, not because the comment section skeptics are shaping policy, but because the frameworks they offer, it's just the sensors. Just drink water. It's just summer. Function as permission structures for inaction. They give institutions and individuals a reason to believe that the trend is either fake or manageable through individual behavior. And the data says it is neither. Part 13, the pattern across the dead, I want to pull back now and look at what the three case studies, Chicago, France, Phoenix, actually share. Not the surface similarity of hot weather and dead people, the structural pattern underneath. Because the pattern is mechanical, and mechanical patterns repeat. In every case, the killing mechanism was the same. Failure of overnight cooling sustained across multiple consecutive days, producing cumulative physiological breakdown in populations that couldn't access functioning mechanical cooling. Not the single hot afternoon. The sequence of hot nights. In every case, the built environment amplified the danger. Chicago's brick retained heat and re-radiated it into apartments for hours after sunset. French stone retained heat and turned top-floor apartments into ovens. Phoenix's asphalt and concrete retained heat and maintained surface temperatures above 140 degrees Fahrenheit long into the night. The material infrastructure of the city became a co-conspirator with the atmosphere, storing daytime energy and releasing it precisely when the body needed the air to cool. In every case, the institutional response was calibrated to the wrong metric or to no metric at all. Chicago monitored the daytime high and activated its response around daytime heat index thresholds. France had no heat alert system whatsoever. 2003 was the wake-up call that created one. Phoenix had excessive heat warnings that covered 71% of the death days, and people died under those warnings anyway, because a warning that says hot and a response system that closes its cooling centers at night addresses the symptom without touching the mechanism. In every case, the dead were concentrated among the isolated, the elderly, the poor, and the marginalized. Klinenberg's social autopsy in Chicago identified elderly black residents dying behind locked doors. Van den Toren's case control in France found bedbound, elderly in top-floor apartments. Maricopa County's demographic data in Phoenix shows unsheltered populations dying at 200 to 300 times the baseline rate. The pattern repeats with mechanical precision. If you are old, if you are alone, if you are poor, If your neighborhood was drawn in red lines before you were born, you die at higher rates. Every time. And in every case, the cities that experienced disaster and then invested in institutional response saw dramatic reductions in subsequent events. Chicago cut its per capita heat death rate by more than 80% between 1995 and 2012. France achieved a 90% reduction between 2003 and 2019. Phoenix is still in the rising phase, still setting records, but its expanding cooling network and dedicated heat response office represent real adaptation that is keeping the toll below where it would be without intervention. This pattern is not confined to these three cases. The Royer multi-country study, covering 178 locations across 44 countries, found the same hot night mortality signal across nearly all climates studied, from Japan to Spain to Brazil to Australia. The overnight mechanism is global, and the vulnerability is not unique to American cities or European capitals. Wherever you find dense urban development, aging populations, heat-absorbing materials, and a warming baseline, you find the same physics producing the same outcome. The details change, the mechanism doesn't, and the international data points towards something that should concern American planners deeply. Some of the highest wet bulb temperatures on Earth are now being recorded in South Asia and the Persian Gulf, regions where nighttime conditions during extreme events are approaching the physiological limits Vecellio documented at Penn State. These are not future projections. They are current observations. The cities of the Persian Gulf have responded with massive investment in air-conditioned infrastructure, an adaptation strategy that works until the grid fails, which is the same trap American cities are deepening every year. In India, where AC penetration is far lower, the overnight heat toll is staggering and undercounted. The official heat death figures from Indian states routinely underestimate the true toll by an order of magnitude because deaths from cardiac failure, renal failure, and dehydration during heat waves are classified by the proximate medical cause rather than the environmental trigger. The pattern is the same one Maricopa County wrestles with. The deaths are real. The overnight mechanism is the driver, and the counting system was designed for a world where heat didn't kill this way. While American cities are not yet at Persian Gulf or South Asian thresholds, the direction of travel, nights warming at nearly twice the rate of days, urban heat islands intensifying with each new subdivision and parking lot, humidity increasing in lockstep with warming oceans, points toward a convergence that's a question of timing, not of physics. But here's what the pattern also says, and I don't want to lose this thread. Every city that invested in overnight specific response, France with its national heatwave plan, Chicago with its welfare check protocols, Phoenix with its 24/7 respite network, reduced its death toll. Not by a marginal amount, by 50, 80, 90%. The technology is known, the policy frameworks exist, the interventions are affordable. Trees, white roofs, backup generators in cooling centers, overnight welfare checks for isolated elderly. The obstacle is not knowledge. It's political will, applied before the disaster, creates the constituency that demands it. The data that would sharpen this picture is specific and attainable. First, continuous overnight temperature monitoring at the neighborhood level in major U.S. metros, not just airport stations, but block by block sensing that captures the microclimate where people actually live. NOAA's community mapping campaigns are a start, but they're snapshots, not continuous records. Second, grid operators publishing overnight demand curves alongside their peak demand forecasts so that the thinning of the overnight trough can be tracked publicly. Third, municipal health departments reporting heat-associated mortality with nighttime minimum exposure data attached so that the relationship between overnight lows and death counts can be tracked in near real time rather than reconstructed months later in medical examiner reports. Without that data, we're interpreting the trend through the rearview mirror, counting the dead and reasoning backward. With it, we'd see the approach before the arrival. The pattern tells you two things simultaneously, and both are true. It tells you that overnight heat is a structural, accelerating, mechanically predictable threat that has already killed tens of thousands and is positioned to kill more. And it tells you that competent institutional response reduces the toll dramatically, that the death counts are not fixed by physics but shaped by choices. Holding both facts at once is the intellectually honest position, and it's the only position from which the three competing interpretations of this data make sense. How you weight those two truths, how much credit you give the adaptation, how much alarm you assign the acceleration, determines which interpretation you land on. And there are three honest answers, each supported by real evidence, each implying something different about what happens next. Part 14, the reassuring reading. I've spent the last 2 hours building a case that overnight heat is an under-recognized, accelerating, structurally embedded threat. And everything I've shown you is true. But intellectual honesty requires me to present the other side of the ledger, not as a straw man to knock down, but as a genuine interpretation that has real evidence behind it. Because it does. Here's the reassuring reading. Adaptation works, it's happening, and in the places where it's been tried, it has saved an extraordinary number of lives. Start with France. In 2003, nearly 15,000 people died. In 2019, under comparable heat, the toll was approximately 1,462, a 90% reduction. Not from changing the climate, not from rebuilding every apartment in Paris, from institutional response, alert systems, outreach protocols, pre-positioned cooling, mandatory welfare checks on isolated elderly. The heat didn't change, the vulnerability didn't disappear, but the system learned to see the danger and intervene before the physiology crossed the threshold. France is the single strongest piece of evidence that this problem is solvable with tools we already have. Chicago tells a similar story. The 1995 disaster killed close to 700. By 2012, a comparable heat event killed 22. The city opened cooling centers. It created buddy systems. It pushed utilities to prioritize elderly customers for power restoration. It changed the institutional relationship between heat and response. The mechanism, nighttime heat in brick buildings, didn't change. The system around it did. Phoenix is earlier in this arc, but moving in the same direction. The city's respite network has expanded to more than 200 facilities. The 24/7 Navigation Center provides not just cooling, but case management for unsheltered individuals. Hondola's Office of Heat Response coordinates across agencies in ways that didn't exist 5 years ago. The death toll is still setting records, 645 in 2023, but the question a careful analyst asks is not just whether the toll is rising, but whether it would be higher without the interventions. And the answer, based on the rate of population growth, the rate of overnight warming, and the expansion of the unsheltered population, is almost certainly yes. The interventions are not sufficient, but they are not nothing, and the tools are improving. Heat risk is nationwide. The NWS is lowering warning thresholds in regions where evidence shows lower magnitude heat kills. NOAA is running block-by-block heat mapping in 60-plus cities. EcoStress is providing 70-meter resolution thermal data to urban planners. The scientific understanding of overnight heat mortality is deeper than it has ever been. Royer's multi-country analysis, Kim's Japanese national study, Vecellio's empirical wet bulb work, the research base is substantial and growing. Air conditioning remains the most effective single intervention. Penetration in the United States is above 88% nationally and above 90% in every major Sunbelt metro. The technology works. When the unit is functioning and the power is on, it reduces heat mortality to near zero for the people inside the conditioned space. That is an enormous buffer between the atmospheric trend and the human consequence. And the technology is improving. Modern units are more efficient, more durable, and better able to handle sustained high-temperature operation than the units that failed in Maricopa County. Building codes in several Sunbelt cities now require higher-rated HVAC systems for new construction. The installed base is stronger than it was a decade ago, and the grid is adapting. ERCOT added more than 11,000 megawatts of solar and battery storage capacity in a single cycle, and navigated the summer of 2025 without conservation appeals, despite setting a preliminary peak demand record of 85,559 megawatts. That represents real investment, real capacity, and real operational success under real stress. PJM's capacity margin, while tighter than some analysts prefer, includes both conventional generation and rapidly growing renewable and storage assets. Grid operators are not blind to the overnight demand shift. They're modeling it. They're investing in response. And the trajectory of renewable and storage additions over the past 5 years is steep enough that grid analysts project continued capacity growth ahead of demand growth in most regions for at least the near term. The international evidence reinforces the optimistic case. Beyond France, cities from Melbourne to Madrid have implemented heat action plans that have reduced per capita heat mortality. Ahmedabad, India, launched South Asia's first heat action plan in 2013 after a devastating 2010 event, and the model has spread across the subcontinent. The institutional learning is not confined to wealthy nations. It's transferable, it's scalable, and where it's been deployed with political commitment, it works. I want to present this interpretation fairly because dismissing it would be dishonest. The evidence for adaptation is real. The precedent, France, Chicago, is powerful. The technological capacity, AC, solar, storage, satellite monitoring, is substantial. And the scientific understanding is deeper than it has ever been, which means the response can be smarter, faster, and more targeted than anything available in 95 or 03. If you weight the adaptive capacity most heavily, and if you assume the institutional learning curve that worked in France and Chicago will replicate across American cities before the next major event, the reassuring reading holds. But there are conditions embedded in that reading, and I want to name them explicitly because they're the hinge points of the entire assessment. The reassuring reading assumes the AC works, and in Phoenix, 85% of the AC units in indoor death cases had failed. It assumes the power stays on, and major outages have roughly doubled. It assumes institutions respond, and most American cities outside the Sunbelt have not built overnight-specific heat response infrastructure. It assumes the most vulnerable people, the elderly, the unsheltered, the isolated, the medically fragile, are reached by systems that have historically reached them last. And it assumes the overnight warming trend doesn't outrun the pace of investment. Each of those assumptions is testable. Each has a track record that can be examined. And when you examine them, when you look not at what the system could do, but at what it is actually doing right now against the measured pace of the trend, the reassuring interpretation begins to crack along specific, identifiable seams. Those seams are where the second interpretation lives. Part 15, the race. The data says we're losing. The intermediate reading, the one the published literature most directly supports, says this: adaptation is real, and it is not fast enough. The race is underway, the institutions are on the track, and the physics is pulling ahead. I want to be clear about what not fast enough means in concrete terms, because it's not a vague pessimism. It means that in the city with the most advanced heat response infrastructure in the country, Phoenix, with Hondola's office, with the respite network, with more than 200 cooling facilities, the death toll is still climbing. It means that the NWS only expanded heat risk nationwide in 2024, which means most of the country has had less than 2 full summers of a warning product that accounts for nighttime heat. It means that NOAA's community heat mapping campaigns have covered 60-plus cities, but hundreds of heat-vulnerable metros have never been mapped at the block level. It means that building codes in most of the country do not require reflective roofing, adequate insulation for sustained heat events, or backup cooling systems. The pieces exist. They are not assembled at the scale or the speed the trend demands. The evidence for this interpretation is in the trend lines. American summer nights have warmed in 96% of analyzed cities since 1970. The rate of nighttime warming is nearly twice the daytime rate. The Climate Shift Index shows the climate fingerprint is concentrated after dark. 86% of the population exposed to nights made at least twice as likely by climate change versus 20% for days. These are not projections. These are observations of the recent past, and the rate is accelerating. Against that acceleration, look at the scoreboard. Maricopa County has set a new record for heat-associated deaths 7 consecutive years. Not 7 consecutive years of record heat, though they've had those too, but 7 consecutive years of record deaths. The adaptation is happening. Hondula's office is working. The respite network is expanding, and people are dying at higher rates every year. The intervention is running, and the gap is widening. This is the pattern that the intermediate interpretation centers on. A race between a trend and a response where the trend is winning. Not because the response is failing, it isn't, but because the trend is compounding in ways the response hasn't matched. The urban heat island is intensifying as cities grow. Every new subdivision, every new parking lot, every new stretch of highway adds thermal mass that charges during the day and discharges at night. The Hoffman redlining study showed that the hottest neighborhoods are the ones with the most pavement and the least canopy, but new development is adding impervious surface faster than tree planting programs are adding canopy. The net heat island trajectory in most growing American metros is upward. Grid margins are thinning in the metric that matters most for this investigation, the overnight recovery window. PJM's aggregate capacity looks adequate, but aggregate capacity doesn't capture what happens when the demand trough that operators depend on for maintenance and reserve building gets compressed by overnight temperatures that won't drop. ERCOT's 2025 success is real, and it came after years of crisis management, conservation appeals, and the near collapse of February 2021. The grid is not fragile everywhere, but the margin between adequacy and emergency is narrower than the headline numbers suggest, and the overnight heat trend is pushing against it from a direction that most grid planning models are only beginning to incorporate. The demographic shift is working against adaptation. The over 65 population is growing. The unsheltered population in heat-exposed metros is growing. Phoenix's homeless population, which Hondula identified as facing 200 to 300 times the baseline heat death risk, has increased in almost every recent count. The share of Americans on medications that impair thermoregulation is growing as the population ages and chronic disease prevalence rises. Every one of these populations is more vulnerable to overnight heat, and everyone is expanding. There's a number from Maricopa County that I think crystallizes this interpretation more precisely than anything else in the investigation. In 2023, among the 645 heat-associated deaths, 71% occurred on days when an excessive heat warning was already in effect. The warning was issued, the public heard it. The cooling centers were open during daytime hours, and people died at more than double the 5-year average rate under active warnings. The system was engaged. The outcome got worse. That's what behind looks like in practice. And here's the finding that I think best captures the intermediate interpretation at the national level. In 2022, 102 U.S. counties set records for their hottest summer nights. 19 set records for their hottest summer days. The nighttime records are piling up at 5 times the rate of daytime records. This is a trend that existing adaptation, cooling centers that close at night, warning systems still calibrated primarily around the afternoon high, grid models that assume a nightly demand drop, was not designed to address. The intermediate reading doesn't say we're doomed, it says we're behind. It says the institutions are learning, the tools are improving, and the physics is moving faster than both. It says the gap between the trend and the response is widening in measurable, published, peer-reviewed data, and that the people most likely to fall into that gap are the same people who have always been most vulnerable: the old, the poor, the isolated, the unhoused, the residents of neighborhoods that were marked in red ink before the atmosphere started warming. And it says something about the nature of the adaptation that I think matters. The adaptation that works, Francis Chicago's, was institutional. It required political will, public investment, coordination across agencies, and a cultural shift in how heat was understood. It didn't happen through market forces or individual behavior change. It happened because governments decided it was their responsibility. And the cities that haven't experienced a catastrophic overnight heat event have, by and large, not made that decision yet. Houston doesn't have a dedicated Office of Heat Response. Neither does Dallas, or Atlanta, or Philadelphia. The institutional infrastructure that France built after 15,000 deaths, that Chicago built after 700, Most American cities haven't built it yet. They're waiting for the event that makes it politically necessary, and the overnight trend isn't waiting for them. The weight of the evidence as I read it falls here, not on the reassuring interpretation, which assumes conditions that may not hold, not on the most concerning interpretation, which requires a compound event that hasn't happened yet, but in this uneasy middle ground between we're adapting and we're not adapting fast enough. This is where the data lives, and it's not comfortable, but it's honest. Part 16, the convergence. Nobody plans for the third interpretation is the one I'm going to present most carefully, because it is the one that could be mistaken for alarmism if I'm not precise about the evidence underneath it. It isn't alarmism. It's grounded in a peer-reviewed model using observed temperatures in an existing city, published in Environmental Science and Technology, but it describes a scenario that the United States has no tested plan for, and the trajectory of the overnight trend is pointing toward it. Brian Stone's 3 heat study modeled a multi-day blackout during a heat wave of historical intensity in Phoenix, temperatures that have already been observed, not projections of a warmer future, and found that roughly half the city's population would need emergency medical care and approximately 13,250 people would die. Those numbers describe a mass casualty event on a scale comparable to Hurricane Katrina, compressed into a shorter time frame and concentrated in a single metropolitan area. One event, one city, temperatures already recorded. The concerning interpretation takes Stone's modeling as the anchor and asks, what does the trajectory toward that scenario look like? And the answer is that several of the enabling conditions are already worsening simultaneously. The grid is growing more stressed. Major outages roughly doubled between the mid-2010s and the early 2020s, a 60% increase over the prior 5-year period. The causes are diverse: aging infrastructure, severe weather events that are themselves intensifying, demand spikes from exactly the kind of overnight heat this investigation tracks, and cybersecurity threats that grid operators acknowledge as a growing concern. Texas came within minutes of a statewide grid collapse during the February 2021 cold event. That wasn't heat, but it demonstrated that the distance between a functioning grid and a collapsed one is shorter than most people believe. A major blackout during extreme heat is not a far-tail hypothetical. It's a moderate probability event on a timeline of years to decades. And the AC dependence trap makes the outcome of such an event worse than historical precedent would suggest. When Chicago lost power in '95, the population had at least some physiological acclimatization to summer heat. People spent time outdoors, buildings had operable windows, the culture hadn't fully retreated into conditioned spaces. Today's urban populations are physiologically different. Decades of near-universal air conditioning have produced a population whose bodies are optimized for 72 degrees. The sweat response is unconditioned. The cardiovascular adaptations haven't developed. Remove the AC buffer, and the vulnerability is immediate. Stone's 700% increase in Phoenix death rates is the quantification of that fragility. This interpretation also looks at the overnight minimum trend and projects forward. If summer nights continue warming at the observed rate and the post-1970 acceleration suggests the pace is steepening, then overnight lows in the hottest American metros will approach the empirical wet bulb thresholds that Vecellio documented within the coming decades, not exceed them routinely, but approach them on the worst nights in the hottest neighborhoods for the most vulnerable people. An approach means that the margin between survivable and non-survivable for someone without functioning AC narrows to a range where individual variation, age, medication, hydration status, body composition, floor of the building determines whether a person lives or dies on a specific night. I'm not going to tell you this interpretation is the most probable. The evidence doesn't support assigning it the highest probability. What I will tell you is that it is physically grounded, it is published, and the compound event it centers on, a multi-day blackout during extreme heat, is something no American city has a tested, exercised response plan for. Stone himself noted that cooling centers in major cities often lack backup generators. Emergency medical systems are not sized for a surge event that sends half a city to the ER simultaneously. The response infrastructure assumes the grid holds. If it doesn't, the plan evaporates at the moment it's needed most. The data doesn't tell us which interpretation is correct. What it tells us is what each one costs if wrong. The reassuring reading costs little if correct, and everything if it turns out to be wrong. The concerning reading costs investment and urgency if correct, and very little if it turns out to be wrong. The asymmetry is the argument. Even if you assign the compound scenario a 5 or 10% probability over the next decade, the expected cost of inaction dwarfs the cost of preparation. And the preparation, trees, white roofs, backup generators, overnight welfare checks, building code reform, is not exotic. It is known, affordable, and deployable. Part 17, What We Know and What We Don't. I want to be as precise as I can about what this investigation has established and where the uncertainty lives. Because the honest framing is not everything is fine or everything is terrible. The honest framing is that certain things are confirmed, certain things are contested, and certain things are unknown, and the unknowns are where the danger hides. What we know. Overnight, minimum temperatures in the United States are warming at roughly 1.45 degrees Fahrenheit per century over the full record and substantially faster since 1970, nearly twice the rate of daytime highs in summer. This is confirmed by NOAA, replicated by Climate Central, and consistent with the physics of greenhouse gas forcing, which operates most powerfully on outgoing nighttime radiation. The trend is not in dispute. What we know. The urban heat island peaks 3 to 5 hours after sunset, driven by thermal re-radiation from impervious surfaces. The nighttime UHI can reach as much as 22 degrees Fahrenheit under optimal conditions. This is confirmed by EPA, UCAR, Cal EPA, and observed directly by NASA's EcoStress instrument at 70-meter resolution. What we know. Nighttime heat is an independent predictor of excess mortality, confirmed by the Kim National Study in Japan, the Royer multi-country analysis, and multiple smaller studies. The mechanism, cumulative failure of overnight physiological recovery, is well established in the sleep and thermoregulation literature. What we know. Formerly redlined neighborhoods are measurably hotter than non-redlined neighborhoods in 94% of the 108 U.S. cities studied. The effect reaches 13 degrees Fahrenheit and is driven by impervious surface and canopy loss. This is confirmed by the Hoffman study and replicated by NOAA's community mapping campaigns. What we know. Institutional adaptation, France's national heatwave plan, Chicago's reformed response protocols, dramatically reduces heat mortality when implemented with political commitment and sustained funding. France achieved a 90% reduction between 2003 and 2019. This is the strongest single piece of evidence on the optimistic side of the ledger, and it is confirmed by mortality data across multiple events in multiple countries. What we know. A multi-day blackout during a heat wave of historical intensity, modeled by Stone and colleagues using observed Phoenix temperatures, produces projected mass casualties on the order of 13,000 deaths in a single metro, and the enabling conditions for such an event are trending in the wrong direction. What we know. The neighborhoods facing the highest overnight heat exposure in American cities correspond, with 94% accuracy across 108 urban areas, to neighborhoods that were redlined in the 1930s. The thermal inequality is structural, measurable, and ongoing. What is contested? Whether minimum or maximum temperature is the better predictor of heat mortality varies by city and by acclimatization status. Davis, Hondala, and Patel found maximum temperature dominant in some northern cities like Boston and Seattle. The scientific community has not converged on a single answer, and the honest position is that both matter, with minimum temperature being the more under-recognized and the more rapidly worsening component. The framing that nighttime heat has replaced daytime heat as the singular threat would overstate the evidence. The framing that nighttime heat is an independent, powerful, and increasingly dominant factor in heat mortality is well supported. What is contested? The rate at which the trend will continue. Climate models project continued and accelerating nighttime warming under current emissions trajectories, but the pace depends on emissions pathways, aerosol changes, cloud feedback mechanisms, and land use patterns that carry genuine scientific uncertainty. The direction is not contested, the speed is. What is contested? Whether the current generation of grid investments, solar, battery storage, demand response will be sufficient to maintain overnight reserve margins as cooling loads increase. Grid analysts disagree on the timeline, and the answer depends on both the pace of investment and the pace of overnight warming, which creates a moving target. What is unknown? Whether any American city will implement France-scale or Chicago-scale institutional adaptation before experiencing a France-scale or Chicago-scale disaster. The historical pattern says no, every city in the record adapted after catastrophe, not before it. Whether that pattern holds is a political question, not a scientific one. And political questions don't carry confidence intervals. What is unknown? When and where the next compound event, a multi-day blackout during extreme heat, will occur. Stone's modeling shows the consequence. The probability on any given summer remains low, but the probability over the next decade, given the documented doubling of major outage frequency and the trajectory of overnight warming, is not negligible. And no American city has a tested, exercised response plan for this specific scenario. What is unknown? How many heat deaths are currently being missed in the official statistics because the decedent was indoors, the indoor temperature was not recorded, and the cause of death was classified as cardiac arrest or renal failure rather than heat exposure. The true toll of overnight heat is almost certainly higher than the counted toll, and we don't know by how much. What would distinguish the interpretations? And this is the part I want you to carry with you because it tells you what to watch for. If overnight warming rates plateau or decelerate over the next 5 years, the reassuring interpretation gains support. If Maricopa County's death toll stabilizes or declines despite continued warming, institutional adaptation is demonstrably outrunning the trend. If a major metro outside the Sunbelt experiences a multi-night event with overnight lows above 85 degrees and the health system responds effectively, if the hospitals don't overflow, if the grid holds, if the welfare checks reach the isolated elderly in time, then the adaptation argument moves from aspirational to proven. Conversely, if death tolls continue setting records in heat-exposed metros, despite expanding response infrastructure, that's evidence the trend is winning the race. If grid stress events multiply, more conservation appeals, more near misses, more hours where reserves fall below the minimum margin, the compound event probability is climbing. If the next major blackout, wherever it occurs, coincides with even moderate heat and produces excess mortality, the concerning interpretation is no longer a model. It's a data point. I'll be specific about the data streams to watch. NOAA publishes monthly temperature departures that include minimum temperature breakdowns. You can track whether the nighttime warming acceleration continues or moderates. Climate Central updates the climate shift index in near real time during heat events. You can see, event by event, whether the climate fingerprint on overnight lows is strengthening. Maricopa County publishes provisional heat-associated death counts monthly through the warm season, the next record-setting year, or the first year that breaks the streak. Tells you something definitive. PJM and ERCOT publish operational data, including reserve margins and demand curves. The overnight trough compression is visible in that data if you know where to look. And heat risk is building its first full year of nationwide coverage right now, which means by the end of this summer, we'll have the first complete national data set that combines daytime and nighttime heat into a single risk picture. The data will arrive. The question is whether the response arrives first. Part 18, the overnight low. I started this investigation with a number, 140 million. That's how many Americans were facing temperatures in the 90s as I sat down to record this. 12 million more above 100. The ridge was building, the advisories were scrolling, and the conversation was, as always, about the afternoon high. I've spent 2 hours showing you why that conversation is missing the most dangerous part of the story, The human body resets at night, or it doesn't. When nights stay hot, the reset fails, and cumulative thermal strain builds across consecutive days until the cardiovascular system, the kidneys, the thermoregulatory machinery itself gives way. This is not speculation. It is documented in the mortality data of 178 locations across 44 countries. It is confirmed in the death certificates of 645 people in Maricopa County in a single year. It is proven in the social autopsy of close to 700 who died behind locked doors in Chicago. And it is written into the stone walls of Parisian apartments that became ovens in August of 2003, in a country that learned, at the cost of nearly 15,000 lives, to never let it happen again. The urban heat island peaks after dark, not at noon, not at 3 p.m., but 3 to 5 hours after sunset, when rural land cools and the city bleeds stored heat into the air that its residents are supposed to be sleeping in. The materials under our feet, the asphalt that absorbs 95% of solar radiation, the concrete that releases it for hours into the night, are thermal batteries that charge during the day and discharge precisely when the body needs the air to cool. The neighborhoods where nights run hottest were drawn in red ink nearly a century ago. The canopy that was denied then is still absent. The investment that was withheld then is still owed. The thermal debt compounds year after year, night after night, in the same blocks that every other form of disadvantage has been compounding in for generations. The grid that keeps the air conditioning running depends on the same overnight cooling window that the body does. When that window closes, the grid loses its recovery margin at the same moment the population loses its physiological margin. Brian Stone's modeling, using temperatures already recorded in a city that already exists, projects that compound failure at a scale this country has not planned for. And the trend underneath all of it, the one that connects the physiology to the pavement, to the grid, to the history, is the simplest and most consequential finding in this entire investigation. American nights are warming nearly twice as fast as American days. The data is from NOAA. It is confirmed by Climate Central. It is consistent with the physics of greenhouse gas forcing that operates most powerfully on outgoing nighttime radiation. And it is accelerating. Mathilde Pascal at Santé Publique France said 2003 was something from the future, telling France it was coming back. I think the same can be said of Phoenix's 97-degree night in 2023. It came from the future. It told us what's arriving. The question is whether the cities that haven't faced it yet will hear the warning, or whether they'll do what Mayor Daley did in Chicago, what the French government did in August of 2003, and decide not to blow it out of proportion until the bodies force the question. I don't have a clean answer. Nobody does. What I have is the data, the mechanism, and the conviction that paying attention matters, that knowing what the overnight low is doing matters, that understanding why buildings hold heat, why neighborhoods drawn in red ink run hotter, why the grid depends on a cooling window the climate is revoking. Understanding these things is the precondition for acting on them. And the people watching this channel have proven over and over that they want to understand. We're going to keep watching the overnight lows this summer. We're going to track the grid margins as the heat builds. We're going to follow the heat risk data as it completes its first full year of nationwide coverage, the first time the institution has counted the nights at scale. And when the next event hits, not if, but when, we'll be here. With the data, with the mechanism, with the context that most coverage leaves out, because somebody should be watching the number that nobody checks. Check your overnight low tonight. Your weather app may not show it, but the number is there. And after everything you've heard in the last 2 hours, you know why it matters.